everybody, what is going on? I am Maximus Rex, and this is Big Baby Reviews. Check out my comics, Big Baby and STARCRASHER at KINGCOMICS.CA. Today, guys, wildcard day, we're taking a look at the last issue of the Dart miniseries, specifically issue number 3, May 1996. This is kind of an Australian production. I've talked about that in past reviews for issue 2 and 1, but I'll go more into detail at the end, as Erik Larsen was nice enough to leave kind of a whole text explaining a little bit how this book came to be. So I'll be reading passages from that when we get there. And the artist here, Joseph SZEKERES, an Australian guy, and his studio was basically tasked with producing this miniseries for Highbrow Entertainment, which is basically Erik Larsen's part of the Image universe back in the day, right? And still today. And the main reason I picked up this series and I'm going through it for the review is just the really amazing art, very original, very different. I don't know if that's a cultural thing too, where like, you know, if you come from Australia or something, you know, just like manga and, you know, people from Asia have a specific way of drawing and a specific style. This definitely feels a little bit different than North American stuff and even, you know, compared to manga or whatever. But beautiful painted art. I definitely think he excels most with painted stuff. The comic itself is pen and ink, really good stuff. Not, you know, definitely not any kind of shitty art on the inside, but I do think where this artist excels the most is when he does this kind of painted style. Looks beautiful. As I mentioned in the past, you know, he now, and has been doing for a long time, he worked for Disney in Australia. He now kind of produces a line of action figures / dolls, which are kind of like really high-end Barbies with very intricate costumes. And when you look at this stuff, it just totally makes sense. What he's drawing here is what he's producing with those dolls over in Australia. So beautiful cover, beautiful texture. Even the background, I find just that slightly furry texture he's added to the drapery and stuff just looks really good. Feels a little bit like a model shoot here, obviously. And there's a lot of focus on the female form and female clothing and female hair. Yeah, does really good job with all of that, I think, on this cover and on the inside of the book as well. So let's crack her open, have a look inside. So I must admit I was a little bit confused when I got to this first page here, because I had to go back into issue 2 to find out what was going on, as her face seems to be wrapped here in some sort of plastic or jellyfish. Wasn't quite sure. And last issue, if you checked out the review, you'll notice that I mentioned that the last panel of the issue, there's no to be continued or anything. So it kind of feels very abrupt as an end. I was almost expecting turning the page and the story continuing, and it didn't. And there's kind of a disconnect, I think, I feel between the last panel of issue 2 and the first panel or the first page of issue 3 here. Almost like there's a bit of storytelling missing. So at the end of last issue, it was almost like a Batman, 1960s Batman kind of death trap that she was tied to, a conveyor belt, and boxes that were ahead of her were being wrapped in plastic or saran wrap or whatever, you know. So we just jump from that, and then here she's already got the plastic wrapped on her face. So storytelling wise, I think it would have just been you know, a good idea either at the end of last issue or right before this panel here to indicate that she's moving on the conveyor belt and the plastic is coming down, and now we understand why her face is wrapped that way. So it's just a little bit jarring storytelling wise, but other than that, you know, some great art in this book and in last issue. So I'm not going to complain too much about that now that I've kind of figured it out. Again, I don't know if this is because he's working for Larsen or if he's a Kirby fan himself, but we get the old splash page on page 1 and then the double page splash here on page 2. I mean, it's a bit of a montage. You could almost say this is one page and this is a different page, but with the kind of Kirby crackle negative space that we get here, and elements crossing over, right? Or that element crossing over from page to page, you could probably define it as a double page spread. So again, pretty good splash here, showing us, reminding us that there's a conflict going on here between the corporate kind of villain team and, oh man, I forget the name, Blood something, of the good guy team, or at least the team that is created by Joseph SZEKERES. So his contribution to Image Comics, I guess, or his creator-owned characters. As we go through the book, I'll be reminded. Oh, actually, it's probably down here. I can't find. Okay, anyways, as we go through the book, the name will pop up again and I'll mention it. So why is the coloring monochrome here? Well, we're going into a flashback sequence, right? So the easiest way to understand that something's happening at a different time or a different place is to do something like that. So as she's kind of suffocating and her face is wrapped in plastic. She can't breathe. She kind of has a flashback to the past here where a little bit of her origins and just some kind of slightly surrealist and kind of off-putting art, right? And this character's teeth, I like the design, but it's just so weird and odd to me where like the bottom of the mouth becomes the teeth. A little bit jarring, I guess. So again, in this moment, we're basically seeing a moment from Dart's past where her and one of her female friends is basically almost sexually assaulted by these gentlemen here. So it's almost got that vibe of a bit of, you know, female revenge on men. So Dart here throws some darts in this guy's ass, which is pretty funny. And this guy gets a glass smashed in his face. So they all kind of get what's coming to them here on these pages here. And maybe this is what motivates Dart to eventually become, you know, a crime fighter or something like that. So back to the present, and Dart really is in dire straits here. She's rescued by this guy here who whips the plastic off her face, but not before she's kind of passed out and not breathing, right? A little sign that there's a lot of violence going on there in her body's the blood pouring out of her nose. So this guy explains that he's one of the characters created by SZEKERES. He's got all these talismans that have different powers, but he doesn't have anything to bring anyone back to life. So he's got to use the good old-fashioned way of mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. And, of course, brings Dart back, right? We knew that was going to happen here. And then they basically kind of introduce themselves to Blood Sheik. That is the name of the team. And, again, these are creator-owned characters owned by Joseph SZEKERES, or at least by his studio. And we've been introduced to them in the past issues here. So I mentioned before how it almost feels like Dart's a little incidental to this miniseries, right? You know, it could almost be a Blood Sheik miniseries rather than a Dart one. And she wouldn't really even have to be in the story and wouldn't affect it. She doesn't affect it that much, I guess. But because it was being published through Image and Highbrow Studios, Eric Larson's studio, I guess they figured they'd probably help sales a little bit to have the focus be at least commercially, marketing wise, on Dart, who's a slightly more well-known character than these guys, obviously, who've never been seen in North America. You know, Dart was at least a character that anyone buying Eric Larson's books was familiar with. I love all the detail here. Like I said, he's really strong with the feminine form and the eyelashes and just the textures and stuff. The hatching on the lips, I think he's just really, really well suited to drawing the female form. And again, very doll-like kind of appearance, slightly Barbie-esque, right? I wouldn't say necessarily they're realistic, but they're definitely evocative of that kind of Barbie Disney vibe that I talked about in past reviews. I mean, this double page splash, like how much time did that take, right? It's really well done. You've got the mall here, all the background characters everywhere. You know, he's not skimping on the people. And always a focus on fashion and clothing, right? You can see his interests. So here's something art-wise that I don't think works that well when you've got two splash pages next to each other. You can almost think that this is a double page splash to a certain extent. It gets a little bit confusing where one ends and one starts. But you get the one splash establishing the mall where the corporate company that owns Blood Sheik trademarks and Dart trademarks are going to be releasing this new line of toys, right? That's kind of the conceit of the whole series. Dart and Blood Sheik have been screwed out of the rights to their action figures and characters. And as I mentioned in the past, I don't know if this is something to do with something that happened to the artist, maybe with some of his characters beforehand with a toy company or with a comic book publisher. And like I said, I'll read the Eric Larson thing at the end, which kind of clues us into that. I had a doubt that something like that was happening. That's why it's incorporated into the story. And I'll give you more detail on that when I get there, because there is a connection there for sure. Love the tilt, right? And you can definitely, you know, feel the fashion influence that the artist has. All the characters, you know, there's no real, you know, kind of standard dress. Each character has just very specific clothing and different kind of style. So that's definitely something that this artist values, right? And you can see throughout these pages. So here's the corporate president launching the new line of action figures with his corporate villains team who help him out here. I always like the design of this guy, kind of freaky, a little bit like a battle beast almost. You know, to make a walrus into kind of an interesting comic book character. I haven't seen many of them. You know, you see a lot of shark characters, but walrus, not so much. And I kind of like it. And it almost feels like, did Eric Larson ever do a character like that? And maybe I'm imagining that, or I'd like to see that for some reason. I don't know if that actually exists. But yeah, the two splash pages next to each other like this, you know, I don't think that's a good idea. especially when both are full bleed, because it almost leads the eye to think that it's the same image and it's not. So just visual storytelling wise, I feel that's a little weak. Both images are great, but side by side, it just doesn't quite work for me. So as our corporate head here is presenting, unfortunately, what he thought would pop up, excuse me, on the screens is the Blood Chic stuff, but it's a line of toys that they've already, created and marketed in the past few years, the Forest Folk, which is kind of a reference to ElfQuest, because this artist worked on ElfQuest at some point. And here's where, again, I feel some of the colors are starting to not quite work. To have the whole crowd be like a monochrome blue, purplish kind of color, that's fine. But it's the value, as to the other colors, the saturation. I feel like they're almost, all these colors kind of have a similar value, so the crowd doesn't quite pop as much as it should, right? So we've got lots of saturated, darker kind of values here. So this should have been very light. Even here with the black, the green kind of background, they're both of similar value, so they don't really stand out. And if you're going to do that, the floor should have been a different color as well here, if you're going to have that green strip at the top. So on these pages here, the colors kind of, to me, interfere with the visual readout of the images and the eye catching quick what's going on. It almost, kind of flattens and eliminates the crowd in a certain way, right? Just too dark. It should have been very light. Interesting layouts on this page here. This character kind of becomes a comet, which is just kind of weird and interesting. I've never seen something like that. It almost reminds me of like when I was early teen, I first encountered Ninja Scroll. All the characters, the villains, their powers were quite different than what I was used to with American comics, and it was just so out there and different. I really thought it was interesting. I was like, man, that's really original. So I would deem this as kind of weird, but also pretty original. I like this idea, this concept. Another great splash page here. Listen, again, the artist is really doing some cool stuff. Definitely skilled in as far as layering and all that. But another page where I find the colors don't really help the visual readout and things get a little bit confusing. I mean, here's just a really good shot of one of his characters and the amount of detail and thought that he puts into the costume design, right? Like, to me, this is almost Mara. From the Aquaman comic, right? She definitely has kind of a undersea fishy kind of vibe to her, but very interesting in how he uses all these different textures from the sea and stuff to define her costume. Even the webbing behind her fingers, a little weird, but just there's something about it that really works and that's coherent to me. I was happy to see this pin up by Joseph SZEKERES, that artist again, more just like the cover in his painted style. And once again, looking at this image, this to me is where he really shines. And again, you can really see the intricate kind of costume details and designs that he's got, really putting a lot of focus, once again, on the female form, the makeup, the eyelashes, the hair textures, and all that. Definitely skilled in that. And this character, I forget his name. Let me just go back because I don't want to... He is mentioned there in his introduction. Yes, Death Gaze is his name, his costume. Let's just be honest, pretty homoerotic, right? Mentioned that before in past reviews. So yeah, like here's another page. If you look at the color, I definitely feel like the contrast and the levels and the saturation, all that are much stronger on this page, and the page just becomes a lot easier to scan and read. And I mean, it's basically just a standoff now between the corporate villains and Blood Chic, who Dart is obviously friends with, and on that side of the aisle here, and as far as their battle against the corporate overlords who are using their images and their trademarks for their own dastardly needs. I don't feel like the art ever drops off either. There's moments maybe where there's, a little less backgrounds and stuff, but, in those instances where he does do the backgrounds, he does such a good job that I'm more than willing to accept. Occasionally it drops off a little bit where like it really becomes very simplified and like almost, dashed out and amateurish, but everything else kind of makes up for it. We get, I also wanted to mention too, I'll go back to that page once again. Sorry guys. Sometimes my thoughts aren't organized and I want to mention something and I have to go back to this page. there's this weird kind of influence on the names from the French language. So, you know, in English we say siren, but it's written with an E here. So that's in French, siren is sirène. You can assume that, you know, siren comes from the French word. Her name is Noyade. Like, I don't know how you would even say that in English. Noyade, you know, and in English you'd have no idea what that relates to. Noyade means to drown, basically. So kind of an interesting choice. I guess she drowns her opponents or something, or she has a relation with Cyrene. They're both kind of water-based things. Death Gaze, that's obviously English, but then her as well, Rosette, which in English, Rosette, I guess is how you would say that. That's a cowlick, basically, in your hair. That's what a rosette is. So, you know, maybe because of her curly hair and extremely curly hair, that's why she's named that. And then this guy, his name is Shaq Splade. So just very odd choices for the names here for these characters. So again, does that come from Australian culture and just there's something I'm not picking up on here that, you know, any Australian person would be, yeah, that's obvious, you know. I'm not quite sure. If you're Australian and you're watching the channel and you're watching this video, let me know in the comments if you know anything about that. Here's another page where I feel like the coloring doesn't help at all. Anytime they pull out this green, I think it's an odd choice. It happens a few times in this issue, and it's just, you know, not an attractive color to me. It doesn't work really well for me, where the other colors do. And up here, the kind of monochromatic character of the color choice here just makes it very confusing. I'm not quite sure what's happening there. So yeah, just the colors overall I like, but little things here and there that just don't work for me. And I mean, it's pretty abrupt how the comic ends, right? They all kind of, you know, are taken down, and Death Stare grabs the corporate guy and flies off with him. And then we find out that he's basically on, you know, that old trope of the abandoned island here. As for Gregory Brockman, that's his name, he survives to this day on a small uncharted South Pacific island, living off the putrid flesh of the local fowl. So he kills some of these guys here and eats them, I guess, is what they're alluding to. So I guess he's got to wait for these guys to mate and create more babies, because if he kills these two, then no more food source. And the fact that it's a South Pacific island, I posited that I think this story probably takes place in Australia, even though Dart's involved, you know, either in Perth or Melbourne or, you know, one of those big Australian cities, Sydney. And again, the creators being Australian, that definitely makes sense to me. And they just kind of wrap up everything really kind of quickly and neatly on this last page. So not the strongest ending here. So they refer to Killcat, right, who has a connection to Dart. They say that the artist, you know, who was forced by Gregory Brockman in issue 1 to lie to Dart and say that she created the character, she's now the head of the company, right? So it's a happily ever after kind of situation here. Vogue Attack is the corporate villain team. Slink away to lick their wounds and fight another day, so pretty convenient. Again, Vogue Attack, you know, Death Stare, Blood Chic, these names are just, again, I would love to know if it's an Australian thing or if it's related to Australian culture. Again, let me know if you know anything about that. Dart leaves for Chicago, so, you know, they never explicitly say that it's taking place in Australia, but again, at least they explain that she was not in Chicago during this storyline here. And Blood Chic continue to right wrongs, but having been burnt by the toy industry, they turn to comics to finance their crime-fighting operations. So again, this feels like a tie-in to what we're going to talk about with Eric Larson and his text here, explaining a little bit about the zeitgeist of how this series came to be, and how they tied some of those elements of reality into the storyline and into the characters. I think I'll try to read this as quickly as possible, but I do think to understand the rest of the actual miniseries and the storyline here, this really helps out a lot. And I'm glad Eric Larson gave us a bit of background detail here, a little behind the scenes, right? I created Dart over 20 years ago. She was introduced in the pages of my unpublished comics that I drew as a kid, and other than her costume being altered to eliminate her plunging neckline, she remained pretty much as I designed her all those years ago. A lot of the characters that I'm currently drawing were created when I was a kid. Okay, this is relates to Eric Larson, so I'll skip ahead a bit. The dragon was... I'm just trying to find the right spot here. Okay, so Dart first appeared in Image Comics in the pages of The Savage Dragon, quickly became one of the most popular supporting characters. That led to her appearance in Freak Force and later The Deadly Duo. It was only a matter of time before she would wind up in her own comic book. Image's executive director, Larry Marder, introduced me to the work of Australia's premier comic book team, Black Mermaid Productions, the studio that Joseph SZEKERES is a part of. I had a long conversation with artist Joseph SZEKERES to begin with, and he sent over copies of Wave Dancers, a comic book that he'd worked on with his partners Bruce Love and Julie Dietrich for another publisher. They are the writers. It was terrific. The project was wildly popular, but it had come to an abrupt halt when they had a falling out with the publisher. So I feel like it's probably over rights and trademark and copyrights, of course, over the ownership of the characters in that book. So I think that's the part that kind of relates to the toy line here and the corporate aspect of this storyline and corporate taking over their trademarks. Joseph and I talked about Black Mermaid producing a Dart miniseries, and he dashed off a few drawings that were later used for promotional purposes. I was determined that Black Mermaid Productions wouldn't have any of the copyright and ownership problems that they had with their prior publisher. Okay, so I immediately agreed to let them retain ownership of everything that they created. Of course, that is, after all, what Image Comics is supposed to be all about. With everything in place, things started to happen. I let Black Mermaid Productions have free reign to concoct the ultimate superhero and book. So that's, again, I definitely feel like this is just kind of a continuation of what they were doing in Australia, and Dart being in the book is just incidental to the fact that Larson's publishing it, and, you know, maybe we put her in there and maybe that helps us on the American market get a bit more visibility. I gave Bruce, Julie, and Joseph the bare bones of an origin for Dart, and they turned it into a fully fleshed out story. They added some of their own characters and really went to town, coming up with an over-the-top, action-packed epic. I would flip that. They used their characters and they added Dart. Bruce Love and Julie Dietrich wrote an outrageous story with surprising twists and turns on every page. Joseph had painted Wave Dancers, but was anxious to give pen and ink a shot and see what could be done with computer coloring. We ran into some problems with the first issue when the people I'd hired to do the color completely fumbled the ball, and In Color was called in to clean up their mess and get the book out on time. This is the first Image comic that I've put out in which I had very limited involvement. You definitely feel that when it's wholly a production of Black Mermaid Studios. Readers used to seeing my mark on my books may find Dart a bit jarring, but that's just fine with me. It is a little bit, but I still enjoy it. I'm not a studio, and I'm not trying to produce scads of cookie cutter comics that all look and read the same, kind of like Extreme Studios and Wildstorm, right? They were kind of doing that Image. There will be more of the same. Body Count, a series that is also coming out through my corner of the Image universe, was written and drawn by Kevin Eastman and Simon Bisley. Can't wait for that when I get all the issues. I have one. I'm working on getting that whole miniseries. It's pretty hard to find and slightly cost prohibitive, but I'm working on it, and when I get them all, I will review it. Big Bang Comics is put together by Gary Carlson, Chris Ecker, and then there's A Distant Soil by Colleen Duran. They're all decent, funny books and well worth your support. All right, that's pretty much all I wanted to read there and clue you in, give you, again, I was very interested in the backstory, and a lot of the stuff that he says here kind of confirms what I thought about the book. Is that how you'd write bitchin'? I feel like that would be an I, not an E. So he mentions those books, and bam, you've got ads for all of them in this one. So, you know, Eric Larson, smart marketer, you know, mentioning the books and then showing you ads for each and every one of them here in the back matter, except for Body Count. And there you go, guys. That is my review for the Dart miniseries. That's going to end it with issue number 3. If you're still watching and you are subscribed to the channel, thank you so much. I really do appreciate all your support. If you're watching, but you're not subscribed, please do so below. It really helps the channel out, helps us grow, and helps get us out there to other people who are into comic books just as much as we are. Once again, guys, thanks for watching. Have yourselves an awesome day.
Like, subscribe, like, subscribe.
King Comics presents Big Baby, Volume 1, Issues 1 to 13, 204 pages of story and art. King Comics also presents STARCRASHER one-shot, 32 pages, cosmic sci-fi surrealist adventure. You can find these fine comics at KINGCOMICS.CA, at MaximusRex13 on Instagram, or on Facebook, MaxRex or Big Baby.